I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Rohitashwa Agarwal, partner, is a leader in Everest Group's global sourcing practice. In his role, Rohitashwa is focused on engagements and initiatives with global companies that focus on GBS shared services centers. Deborah Cobbs, executive advisor, serves as an advisor on the research and strategic content of Everest Group's Global Business Services Program. Apart from her work with Everest Group, Deborah is the principal of Sourcing Change, a role in which she helps leading GPS organizations, providers, and investors drive change in their global services and enabling technology mandates and initiatives. Victoria Rorick, Senior Director of Strategy, Transformation, and Change Management at PepsiCo, is responsible for GBS strategy definition, project management development, and delivery of GBS transformation, including change management. A graduate of Georgetown University and a Deloitte Consulting alumna, Victoria joined PepsiCo in 2018. She is also a founding member of the PepsiCo GBS Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. Arushi Gupta is a senior analyst in Everest Group's global sourcing practice. In her role, Arushi is responsible for assisting GBS organizations and global service providers on many aspects, such as cost optimization, location selection decisions, peer benchmarking, and talent model redesign. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Rohitashwa.
Hey, thank you, Raphael. Welcome and greetings, everyone joining us from different parts of the world. We have a truly global panel today. I'm joining in from London. We have Victoria from US, Deborah is in Poland, Arushi is in India. So let us know in the chat where are you joining in from. How we are going to use the next 55 minutes is by dividing our focus into three key components. We will unpack some of the key findings from a recent research on change management topic in the first part of this discussion. Then we will get into categorizing organizations into their different change management personas based on how they approach this important initiative. And third, towards the end, we will summarize what we have put together as a 12-step program that can help GBS organizations implement change management. We will keep some time at the end for Q&A, but during the entire session, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A window. As we get started, Deborah, let me bring you in, help us understand, how do we define change management in the context of GBS organizations?
All right. Well, change management is many things to many folks, but if you think about it, change management in the GBS context is really about helping the enterprise and all its stakeholders, whether they're users, whether they're functions, whether they're the business, actually perform work. What we're doing is asking our stakeholders to work in new and different ways, whether it's technology, through process, dealing with other locations and cultures. And we define GBS change management as a suite of activities that help our stakeholders, whomever they are, adopt and embrace and hopefully sustain new ways of working. It's really that simple, Rohit.
Brilliant. And Victoria, did you see it in the same way in context of PepsiCo or differently?
Yeah, thank you, Rohit, for that, and welcome everyone. What I do really like about the definition that Deborah walked us through is it really focuses on the ability to amplify and to multiply the impact that change management has. And I'm excited to share a bit more later on our time today, but that's really how we've sought to define it within the PepsiCo context. right? So it's not just project focused, it's really a full suite, really a full ecosystem of how change management can support us on our full strategy and transformation throughout the GBS journey.
That's an important articulation. Thanks, Victoria. So, what we're going to share today is based on an important piece of research we did over the last several months. We analyzed about 58 global GBS organizations through a combination of survey and direct discussions. And this was a very diverse, truly global pool. We covered CPG, life sciences, financial services, different industries. We covered some of the leading organizations across all different verticals. So we really wanted to understand what are the similarities and differences across GBS organizations serving different industries, different geographies, and performing different functions. On the next slide, we'll see some more details about who we covered in this research. What we have there is about 50% of these 58 companies were North America headquartered, another 42 Western Europe and UK. So a lot of these firms have global GBS footprint with centers in North America, Europe, UK, and then spanning into near far short locations across APAC, others. There are some organizations headquartered in APAC as well. And we covered all different size of organizations. So there were a large number of them, fairly big, more than 10 billion revenue, but also some others. Fairly good diverse mix there. And hopefully all our listeners today will find the takeaways relevant and useful. Deborah, walk us through some of the key takeaways.
All right. Well, to some extent, this is a very sobering piece of research. We asked our respondents on a scale of 1 to 10, how critical do you see change management? And 75% said this was definitely a 10, that change management is critical to the success of a GBS organization. But what we found when we started to unpack the data is that even in some of the largest companies that Rohit just spoke about, change management, having a capability that's established and staffed, resourced and funded is not necessarily a GBS given. Many organizations are still appointing or volunteering people to become change managements. It's not typically viewed as systemic. Most change management activity is focused on a project, a transition, a technology transformation. Many of our organizations did not include change management as part of their strategic GBS footprint. And also it's not necessarily getting the airtime at the top of the house in GBS excos. It often is buried beneath a program manager or a transition management team. We found that there's some challenges with how fellow GBS leaders looked at change management that was a little bit problematic. We saw that our respondents are very concerned about the level of talent in change management, and they're looking for folks who understand GBS, because GBS change is very different from OCM change. We didn't see prevailing methodologies, and last but not least, when we asked our respondents how they knew change management was working, it was like the smiley faces when you walk through an airport. How was your security today? So the findings were, to be honest with you, head scratchers, and we'll unpack that in a minute.
Got it. As we proceed, let's take a poll. We would like to listen from our listeners today. How do they define GBS change management approach? Deborah shared her definition earlier and Victoria added her perspective, but let's see, how do our listeners see this? We are seeing a large number of responses coming in. We'll give it a few more seconds. All right, I'll count to 10 from here, and then we'll stop this. 5, 4, 3, 2, another second, and all right, let's look at the results. About 45% say it's critical. Another 39% say it's strategic role that this capability plays. Deborah, Victoria, what do you say about that?
Well, a little bit surprised, very honest, that our audience today is skewing on the side of change management is part of what GBS organizations do, as opposed to basically cover up any noise and focus on telling. So not the norm with what we saw this summer. Victoria?
Yeah, I'd also add that, this is where I also ask myself, where is the aspiration versus where it might be in practice or in reality? And so, even flipping this question a bit, I find myself more often than not clarifying what GBS change is not, especially when I work with the business stakeholders in GBS and how we move forward. But, to Deborah's point, I do think the aspiration and definition is really reflected in what we see in the poll results here.
Great. So, Deborah, we've been talking about what we did over summer. We did this study. Tell us more about this study.
All right. Well, we looked at 15 aspects of change management, and you get a sense here. We looked at operating model, role, planning, the talent model, how GBS change management is funded, how people know they're successful, and what we'll do today in the interest of time. And for those of you who want to read the 40-page report, certainly have at it. You'll learn everything you never knew you needed to know about GBS change management. Let us unpack today some of the factors that are colored in green. So if we can go into the next slide.
And Deborah, I'll just one reminder before we start unraveling is that while we are sharing some of these key takeaways today, the full report will be available to our listeners today. So watch out for more details and link to the report in the chat window.
Great.
Thank you.
I think, when we asked our respondents to tell us what they thought change management was, they view it in the main over 50%. That's a pretty substantial number and a little bit surprising. See it as a tell. It's a way to diminish, it's to sweep the noise that is represented, often usually comes with the change that GBS represents under the rug. Compared to the poll we just took, Rohit, only 16% see it as a critical component. It's part of everything GBS does. GBS represents constant change. So still, do I want to say dark ages? But a little bit surprising, given the maturity of the shared services and GBS model, that in 2022, 2023, we're basically seeing, our respondents see change management as a palliative and not a way to change the way people work. Very, very concerning, to be honest. So what else did we see? If we can go to the next slide. Also saw that in many cases, GBS change management as a competency was an afterthought. The catalyst is during transition. In other words, let's ease the pain of moving work from one part of the world to another, from one technology or no technology to another. But we did find that about 25% saw it as strategic enough to implement it at the outset. In fact, in a previous webinar on this topic, Sam Barani of Fresenius, a new build GBS, his first hire was a GBS change manager. So we see people looking at it as strategic, but comparing with the last result, the challenge is, quite honestly, that we see it as a strategic tell. How's that? If we can go to look at another factor, here we see it as important, but it's not generally viewed as a GBS enabler. To some extent, the results were a little bit like watching The Exorcist with a head spinning. About 30%, about a third of our folks see GBS change managers in a transversal capability, touching everything that GBS does. But the remainder of our respondents basically see it either a comms function or an aid for a specific program. So it's not seen as an overall GBS enabler, but what it's seen as is let's tell people and let's help them through the pain. The challenge we would put forth is, does that really constitute strategic change?
Just to add a perspective onto that, right? I think one of the things that we see very often in our PepsiCo GBS journey is that change is seen as the responsibility just of the change team, no matter where you may put it, right? So Deborah, you just walk through perhaps where the lines and boxes may report up into. But I think a very important part of the mindset and behavior shift is also really explaining that change is every GBS leader's responsibility, whether change is in their title or not. And also really having the change team play a role in building that capability. Often, very times in the senior leaders that really are the business owners that are driving the change, sponsoring the change. So I think that's also an important complementary piece that I would add to really think about how change can be part of this systemic approach within GBS.
And so many, Victoria, good point. So many GBS organizations think that it's a Band-Aid and it's the purview of the change team. They don't understand that the change team is not like Santa Claus. It's not omniscient. It can't be everywhere, that everyone, even somebody in a call center, is responsible for change management to some extent or another. So what else did we learn? We found, for example, that even though, again, 75% of our 58 folks said, this is a 10 out of 10. A third didn't have a dedicated competency, and a lot of volunteering. Oh, why don't you pick up a few pointers from communications and you're instantly a change manager. We found that a little over a fifth actually reported to GBS or shared services leader, but for the most part, it's a function or a capability that doesn't necessarily have airtime at a top table. Now, I happen to believe that where your leader is positioned in an organization matters only somewhat. If you've got a good leader who's a head of strategy and he or she will support this, it works very, very well. But what's so funny is the definition of GBS is actually constant change, yet the strategy, the methodology, the mechanics is often at the bowels of the organization. Victoria, I'm assuming PepsiCo doesn't do that. They've learned their lesson. Am I correct?
I think we've certainly evolved over time, and it's something that I'll talk about. But I think, if I think about the role that change plays, again, certainly we talk about change being everyone's role, but we have it tightly and intimately tied as part of our overall strategic and transformational plan and agenda.
Okay. So what else did we learn? Let's go to the next slide if we could. We asked about critical success factors. In order to deliver impact from an investment in a change management capability, what needs to be true? And no surprise, number one was got to understand the business needs. I think that's a given, that there needs to be a mandate for change. And we all know that not all GBSs have a mandate for change. What really surprised us and is very concerning is that third point, the understanding of the benefits of change management within the GBS team. So what we're finding in the organizations we talk to is that the biggest resistance The biggest challenges are actually people in the GBS. Look, we all think that change management is about having a good relationship. It's actually a process. So it's very hard often for a senior GBS leader or even a manager. They don't want to be told change management is both an art and a science. It needs to be measured. It is a process. It is a continuous reinforcement. It's a continuous messaging. It's a continuous listening and understanding about what the organization can sustain. So this resistance internally probably is the most surprising thing that we saw in our research. Yes, it's good to have a dedicated team. Methodologies are great, although one of the things we found is many organizations do not have a methodology. They make it up as they go along. Funding is good, but I think the pivot for us, the aha moment for us is that our first change management activity is changing our own GBS teams, not the business. Staffing models. Our respondents found that there wasn't enough talent out there, and often they didn't want to pay for the talent that was there. But the prevailing model is hybrid, which is understandable. Have a core team of folks who understand the stakeholder, understand develop methodologies, are the keeper of the flame, and then as projects or programs ebb and flow, go out to the interim or contractor or consultant market in some cases and augment a team. So it's very clear by our results. Our respondents don't need big teams, but they need to be flexible. They can beg, they can borrow, they can steal, but having a team of 50, 60, 70 change managers is not only not in the cards, but there are other effective ways to resource a staffing model. What impacts the model? We found that typically the larger the GBS, no surprise, the larger the GBS, the larger the staffing model. Size and maturity made a difference. In other words, the more mature the GBS, we typically found more of a hybrid function, and also focus on cost containment. We found an inverse relationship between the focus on cost and the structure of the model. So let's
Deborah,
unpack.
we've got a comment here in the chat from Steve, who also puts in the point of seconding people from the business to play in these roles. I think this is a really important lever to pull, especially as you think about resourcing a team, because the ability to navigate through the organization, I find to be very critical in supporting the change management for GBS. I think that's certainly one of the best practices that we have seen within PepsiCo. So I wanted to make sure, thank you, Steve, for that comment, and absolutely welcome and encourage any other points that folks want to add as we go through.
Great point, Victoria. Let's talk a little bit more about staffing in GBS, if we can look at the next slide. A corollary to the statement about a hybrid model is dedicated staffing levels are actually pretty low. The majority of respondents had dedicated staff, full-time GBS leaders, 66%. Larger the GBS, the more dedicated staff, but we're not talking about armies of 1,000. If you look at the life cycle of a GBS, a lot of the change management actually is handled by the transition team. So if you take Victoria's point that everybody in a GBS is a change manager, the industry understands that and is not building empires or armies. Again, what affects it? Size, positioning, global reach. Typically, the more global, the larger the team. And Victoria, you may have a comment on that. And also, we found that captive models tend to have a larger dedicated staff than hybrid models that aggressively incorporate outsourcing. Victoria, we've talked about global reach. You have a view on the global reach, the importance of global reach of a GBS team?
Absolutely. So I will acknowledge that we do have a captive model. And I think as part of that, right, we have a GBS in which all of our geographic sectors are part of our GBS journey. And I think that's very critical to keep in mind because, like many of your organizations, we want to have this concept of one PepsiCo, right? One unified organization, but you also have to take into account the cultural nuances, right? Of your business units, of your GBS hubs. So PepsiCo's GBS change team is one where we've invested in, right? I'll talk more about the evolution and journey because we had to build and scale that capability over time, but it is part of making sure that as we go through this strategy and transformation, that it lands in the right way, really pulling on the right tailored approaches as well to account for the full global reach that we have within PepsiCo.
Funding construct, and we didn't get a lot of transparency, to be honest, on funding and the level of investment, but we did get a sense that for the most part, the funding comes from projects. We still think project, we don't think systemic. So the cost of a change leader or associated expenditures is typically budgeted through transformation, transition, a technology project, rather than part of overall SG&A. And we did see some organizations that split funding. There was project-specific budgets, and then there was business as usual or ongoing systemic, and often communications budgets were put into that BAU budget. But for the most part, we pay for it when we've got a specific project budget. We don't like to include it as a line item. So the operating model all lines up pretty well.
And Deborah, something very interesting in there, because in a lot of our conversations, while there was a small dedicated budget, the argument was also that a lot of budget is distributed across projects. And while that's a good thing because there is overall investment, the point you make around that prevents it from becoming systematic, right? And then kind of it comes and goes, which creates clunkiness in the way this capability evolves. I think that's an important call out, and in a lot of conversations, often underappreciated.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it this way, we fund change management when there is a change, but we don't fund the change that's represented by a GBS model, because GBS changes the organization in some way, form, or fashion somewhere every day. So we fund it when we can see something, an event that's changing, we fund it. Otherwise, we sort of stay away. You know, one of the questions we asked, which is a corollary to this, Rohit, was what are we spending our money on? And for the most part, our respondents say that they're spending their money on communications, planning and delivery, and stakeholder management. But we did see some difference. We saw more scope, customer centricity, digital adoption as a GBS matures and ages. We found that those organizations that just see GBS as a cost play actually limiting their focus to communications and a little bit of help in the transition process. We also saw some cultural change. European organizations are more focused on the change readiness of stakeholders and customer centricity than North Americans are. We could debate that for hours. We found captive organizations typically included more scope than a hybrid. And last but not least, one of the questions we posited is that GBS organizations, when they pursue a digital agenda, does this open up the floodgates for a more aggressive, a higher list of activities within the change management function? And we found some. It wasn't overwhelming, but we saw that there was a greater focus on customer centricity and experience, because there seems to be a corollary between digital and experience. So we saw that happening as well. So, you know, everyone focuses on communications, but depending on who, what, when, how, it's a plus and a plus and a plus.
Deborah, I want to just add something onto that last point, because I think for many of you within your respective GBS organizations or perhaps serving GBS clients, GBS really is the digitization engine for organizations, right? And so, Deborah, I think about the point you made, which is, look, a lot of organizations tend to fund or tend to be reactive when there's a small change. But if you sit in the organization that is leading, bringing the digital age to your company, you have to focus on change with a capital C, right? So I, more than ever, this really gives that imperative, that mandate for change, Deborah, that you referenced earlier.
So what did we do with all of this? Well, one of the things that we is very popular right now is to develop personas. So the Everest team and I look for patterns in our results to see whether we could come up with some personas that GBS change leaders could identify with. So if we could flip next, Rohit, that would be
And Deborah,
great.
before you hand over to before you and Arushi take us through the personas, I see some questions in chat, but I also want to just remind all our listeners to put questions. We already have a long list in the Q&A, and we'll start sorting through that, preparing for the end of Q&A part, end of the session part. So just encouraging everybody to put their questions in the Q&A window. Back to you and Arushi, Deborah.
Yeah, Arushi, you're the architect of our persona. So why don't you walk our participants through what we actually saw in the data?
Sure, Deborah. Thanks, Rohit and Deborah, and I'm glad to be here today. So as Deborah mentioned, in a bit to add an interesting touch to how we all can assess our GBS change management personas, we here at Everest Group and Sourcing Change, we give shape to 4 distinct personas based on the maturity of an organization's GBS change management team. Interestingly, these personas are being ranged from the naysayer head shakers who are yet to establish a change management competency, and they still shrug off on the concept of having a GBS change management competency within the organization, to the budding crawlers that have at least started to accept the idea of having a GBS change management competency within their organization. Next up, we have the influential or the game changers, as we call them, who are excited enough and they continue to be ahead of their times. And lastly, we have the ever-wise institutionalists who are leading the pack.
Okay, and I think it's important, there is a level of maturity here. But there are some one of the things we found is that there are some very mature GBSs that are still trying to get it right, and they're either crawlers or game changers. So age scale doesn't necessarily mean that you're an institutionalist.
Absolutely correct, Deborah. To give you everyone insight into how we created these personas and how you guys can evaluate where you all stand. We have basically laid down certain dimensions across which you can try to map your current GBS change management practice. So I would start from the left hand side to the about the head shakers. So we see that head shakers are the ones that do not yet see change management as a critical competency. Change in these organizations, they are typically managed on an ad hoc basis, and these teams are underfunded. The talent in these teams are mostly borrowed from the enterprises, and change is heavily equated to being a mere typical communications function. And in a nutshell, we see that these organizations are considered to be laggards when it comes to establishing this GBS change management competency. And as Deborah rightly mentioned, it does not matter which size or scale you're operating at. We did see some leading players in the market under the head shaker category as well. Not that we are saying that it's wrong to be in that, because this competency or this persona may work for some people. However, there are other personas or other journeys that the GBS change management teams could also take. Next in our personas range comes the crawlers. They see GBS change management as somewhat a critical function, and they have started to invest in it for their transformation and transition projects. The change talent here may be outsourced to certain specialized firms or a suite of consultants. However, there is a presence of a GBS layer within the organization that is responsible and that overlooks over their responsibilities. Here, in addition to the communications, these teams also go ahead and they also try to chart out ways to diminish the employee resistance and suppress it to an extent. Next, we have the influential people or the game changers, where, as the name suggests, they recognize change management as strategic. They have established the competency during a transition to a GBS model, and they approach it in a more holistic manner. And they go in the sense that they go beyond the basic communications and the suppression of the noise within an organization. There's a higher level of dedicated and structured investments that is being done for these GBS change management teams, which is also reflective in the fact that the teams have a composition of a mix of dedicated GBS FTs as well as contractual change experts. Lastly, we have the institutionalists, which are leading the way for the entire pack by having a transversal change management competency in their GBS right from where the GBS was set up. These teams get dedicated fundings year on year, and the team here is more permanent in nature, which helps and defines and executes many short-term and long-term change management goals for the organization. Here, the methodologies are more structured. It is less ad hoc. There are definitive plans in place. And lastly, the ROI here, it goes beyond only measuring the happiness quotient of the employees and the other stakeholders.
So we'd ask all of you, before we turn it over to Victoria, those of you on the webinar today, think about where you actually are. And when we looked at how this skews, relatively few institutionalists, most of our concentration is in crawlers and game changers. We also found that participants in our study were actually pretty honest about where they are. They are very respectful of the fact that maybe they are not as far along on their GBS change journey as they should be. So kind of a bell curve distribution, but very few institutionalists and a little too many head shakers for the maturity of this industry. So let's get a little bit more color from Victoria. So Victoria, let's talk about where PepsiCo actually is.
Thank you so much, Deborah and Arushi. I think it's really a fantastic slide that grounds all of us in where are we today and what is the aspiration to get to in terms of that strong and impactful GBS change support. Big thank you to Everest for inviting me here today. It's an absolute privilege to be with everybody. Again, I'm Victoria Rorick, and I lead PepsiCo's GBS strategy, transformation, and change management capability. And I'm also privileged to lead a team of expert change practitioners. And I'm very excited to really show the impact and work that they have built in terms of supporting us on our GBS journey today. I want to very quickly contextualize PepsiCo and our GBS, but I'm going to do it by asking all of you a quick question, which is, for those of you who are in the US, who plans on watching the Super Bowl here in a few weeks? I saw a lot of people on the chat today are located in the US. Or for those of you that might sit outside of the US, how many of you watched the World Cup about a month ago? I start with that question because I always love to watch the Super Bowl or World Cup to watch the ads, right? If you're like me, I forget about the games most of the time. I want to see the exciting commercials. What are the new products out there? And I'm very proud to say that as part of our PepsiCo GBS organization, our GBS organization helps produce the marketing assets that are in those commercials. And I'm not going to go through all of the stats that you see here on the slide, but I think they contextualize the global scale. But what I want to call out is, this is clearly a big change for how PepsiCo does business. right? So we are leaning on our GBS organization to help drive that top line revenue growth in the biggest events for our organization, like the Super Bowl or World Cup. And so I start off by that because that gives you a sense of change with a capital C, right? That systemic change that we're facing our business with when it comes to our GBS journey. So what I want to talk to you a bit more about is our evolution, which I'll get into here next, of how we've built our PepsiCo GBS and our change journey. What I'll point out, right, is I'm super proud of where we are today, but this is also an evolution and a journey as you think about your own change organizations. We did start our change journey from the outset, right? So in 2018, we really started on our GBS journey for PepsiCo overall, and we initiated our overall change capability. We were also very mindful to start with the principle of adoption over perfection, right? So for many of you in your organizations, right, you also want to think about how do you instill change, meeting your stakeholders halfway, especially when you're starting to prove out the model, right? In the following years, this is where the transformation really started. And so as Deborah mentioned, right, we really focused the change efforts on transition because that's where the music was playing at that time. But we also used that as the opportunity to scale and institutionalize those change approaches and assets, which I'll talk more about in a moment, and I'll share an example with you all to make it a bit more practical. But we also thought it was important. We also thought it was an important part to measure where we are in our journey, right? So many of you have submitted some questions and asked, how do you use technology to really think about the change that you're trying to instill? And so we run a frequent process to get that adoption sentiment, that customer sentiment. We call it our ways of working survey. And it's something that is an absolute gold mine of information that we can cut in any which way to see how is the change being adopted? How are customers perceiving us? We also use voice of the business, and we also measure our own GBS teams to get their point of view. And I'm also really, really proud to share that this was something that has now been adopted as a best practice for all PepsiCo transformation initiatives. So this is something that we started, but this was also something that then corporate had asked other big transformation projects to adopt, right? GBS during COVID, there's a lot of great detail in the report that actually talks about how change took on different meanings for GBS organizations during this time. But we really doubled down and said, look, as our GBS strategy really takes off during COVID, change needs to have that seat at the table, working with our functions, working in our op model to provide that support and impact. And then last but not least, as I think about last year and the years ahead, many of you, in light of COVID and in light of some of the economic challenges, you may find that your organization is, again, really looking to see what value GBS can add for your company or your organization. PepsiCo certainly has. And I think one of the things that's been very important for us is to be able to directly align our GBS change strategy, not just with our overall GBS strategy, but indeed our overall PepsiCo strategy. So having that full line of sight, right, from the top down. And I'm excited about the years ahead because we're all about amplifying and multiplying this approach of systemic change throughout our organization. So next, let me just highlight some of the key ways that we've been able to do that, right? I think one of the first things that I want to note is that GBS is likely not the only change that your organization is undertaking. In fact, if I think about PepsiCo, GBS is just one of the many acronyms in our alphabet soup of different programs or projects or initiatives that are happening. So I think that gives even more of a mandate to look at this from truly systemic point of view, especially keeping your customer in mind, right? Your business units that will bear a lot of the impacts that will be happening, right? So I think that's been a big principle and best practice that we've thought about. I think another big piece is really thinking about how do we scale and tap into the networks, tap into the methodologies of focusing on that change, right? So PepsiCo and our GBS is quite big in scale. We have about 6,500 associates in GBS today. And so we are constantly challenging ourselves to say, how do we avoid the death by a million paper cuts approach, right? So if we are only focused on delivering the change impact assessments and analyses at a project level, we won't be able to affect the bigger cumulative impact that we want to make happen. So a few things that we do, right? We focus on really tapping into a change network, both of expert change practitioners, as well as change ambassadors and business leaders that really voice and demonstrate to other leaders how they have change with a seat at the table. We do the measurement of ways of working. We also use organizational network analysis at times, right, to see where are the connection points, right? If we have a detractor that we're looking to convert, who are the right people that might help influence him or her? I think tying this into our overall organizational culture is important, right? Incentivizing the behaviors that we want to change as we talk about new ways of working. I think the last piece that I'll preview before I get into the next slide to really kind of bring to life how we think about institutionalizing this is that we really make it a point to use a standardized framework, tools, processes, and assets that can be deployable, that can be scalable. Now, to Deborah's point, it's both an art and a science. And I like to say often that it's like cooking, right? When you start cooking, you're going to have your recipe book right next to you, step by step. Did I do the change impact analysis? Have I gone through and analyzed all my stakeholders? But when you get good at cooking, or when you get good at change, you know innately where you're going to be able to switch up the recipe, be a bit creative to get to the results that will really make the right impact. So we have an organization that's really grounded in having those standard frameworks while always reserving the right to sit with our business partners and be that creative cook to best meet their needs. And so what I just want to show you, right, because many of you may be thinking about, how do I think about an asset like this? This is a snapshot of one of our examples of how we have that scalable, repeatable approach for change management. And let me actually focus on the transition column, because Deborah, as you've mentioned, right, many of you here on the call today might really have transition be the focus of your change today, right? So in tandem with our overall transition capability, we've identified the right moments, whether aligned to the right governance checkpoints, or in the right phases of transition, whether it's knowledge capture, knowledge transfer. And we've really embedded to say, here's the asset, or here's the framework, here's the intervention that we will run throughout the transition process. What we also make sure that we do is we constantly refresh this, right? So I can tell you right now that we're working with business stakeholders, our transition team, to evolve this and say, how do we make this even better, right, as we continue to transform our organization? The other thing that we do is we train the non-change stakeholders on this as well, so that they can articulate the importance of each of these interventions, and that they are willing, not just willing participants, but willing leaders to champion this. And so this is one example of a toolkit, right? I would also call out, you know, Deborah, you also had another fantastic slide that called out, what are the elements of systemic change, whether it's governance, strategy, catalyst, resourcing model, right? So for those on the call today, you can ask yourselves, what is the role that change plays? And what might those right sort of horizontals, if you visually, anchor on the slide I've shown here, to really customize and tailor and build that framework for your own organization in that way. So I know we're gonna move towards a poll here in a moment, but again, very big thank you to Everest for inviting me. I really encourage everyone to read the report. I find myself going back and highlighting and rereading, and happy to always chat change in the subject.
Hey,
Rohit?
thanks, Victoria. I was going to ask you a couple of questions, but I see the poll has started and responses are coming in. So we'll quickly look at the result, and then I'll just ask you a couple of questions that came in specific to the messages you shared. But I see very quickly responses are coming in. A lot of our respondents see themselves as game changers, and then crawlers who are kind of looking to progress, which is not completely surprising given the responses to initial question on how they are defining change management and looking at that as a priority. Uh, while we wait for some more responses, I think this is, we have about 50 plus already. But Deborah, Victoria, any quick reaction? Are you surprised to see this?
No, it follows along with what we saw in the research, Rohit. Maybe a little bit surprised that there are more game changers, but obviously this is a motivated audience.
Yep, true. So Victoria, let me ask you this, right? We are entering into the last, we are into the last 10 minutes of the session already. So let me ask you a question. So when you define the ways of working and how you measure that, how do you partner with GBS service management and process governance functions? So the question is that, does change management handle things separately? Do you partner with those functions or teams? How does that work?
It's a great question, and I'm going to run the risk of being a bit controversial here in my answer. So like many of your GBS organizations, we report on our SLAs, our KPIs, and we work with our performance measurement and management team on that. But what we've heard from our stakeholders is, you guys are always green. Why am I hearing different noise? Or why am I hearing different feedback on how you're performing? So we work very closely with the performance measurement team to do exactly that, right? So we have them at the table because you really need both components to provide that full picture and frankly, to sometimes have that credibility with leadership, with the decision makers and understanding where are we on adopting GBS. I would also say that in terms of publishing our ongoing performance scorecard, we have one column or one element of it fully dedicated to measuring the ways of working. So it's integrated in. My team is the one that runs, the survey process end to end, but we really make sure that it's part of that full performance picture when the operational teams do their operational governance and other discussions with their ultimate end users and customers.
Hey, thanks for sharing, Victoria, and to our listeners, feel free to chime in the chat window in case you have tried that, it works, something else works for you. It'll be good to hear. Deborah, as you take us through the 12-step program, one question to keep in mind, we have a good question which says, what tactics have you seen business and GBS use to kind of get past the scars of the organization impact that comes with impacting the GBS? So Deborah, over to you to help us.
Well, that's a very simple answer. The scars, scars happen for a number of reasons. Firstly, the organization does not understand why the change is happening. I'm not saying they commit, but they don't understand. That's certainly point number one. Second is there's no process to help them understand. Remember, what we're trying to do here is first adopt new ways of working, embrace them, and then hopefully over time sustain them. And the scars often are due to the fact that there's no change management or it's suboptimal change management. So that's a good segue into a 12-step plan. It's great to say fix it. It's another thing to say this is how you fix it. So with apologies to Alcoholics Anonymous, we've identified 12 things that GBS organizations need to do. First of all, get rid of the drug of project change management. Make it part of everything GBS does. This is probably first and foremost the biggest challenge, because our leaders in GBS are hardwired to think that this is about transition change and about comms and about diminishing resistance. It's about it touches everything. Make it part of everything. Number two, make it transversal. I've seen too many organizations that have a little bit of change management in the finance tower and nothing in HR. Make it pervasive, make it consistent. GBS change management gives a GBS a brand. So having one way of working across all processes and function is very critical. Number three, rethink the scope. It's not just communications. It is so much more than comms. And the corollary to that is communications is not change management. Communications is a tell. Change management is an engagement. It's a listening. So don't confuse the two. There are too many organizations who think that they put in communications and they can tick the box on change management. It's just not so. Again, back to our 48% of respondents who said the team alignment is a challenge. Get them aligned. Don't make it too complicated for them. Give it to them in bite size. Have them understand it's a process. And then build the right organizational construct. You don't need an army of thousands, but the GBS is an army of thousands that makes change. So learn how to work through other teams, learn how to work through other parts of the enterprise, build the right organizational construct. The right talent is really important, and we didn't touch very much on this, but our respondents are very concerned about the dearth of good GBS change management talent. Obsess about getting the right folks. Don't hire someone just because they're young and cheap. Bring in the right talent. It will pay back. Their ROI will be phenomenal. Offer career paths. I think Victoria touched on this earlier. It's very hard to work in a job when you don't know that you're going to be able to progress. Change management career paths can go elsewhere in the GBS. In fact, if you look at the capabilities our respondents identified for change managers, they're exactly the same as transformation managers. So offer people career paths. Otherwise, they're not going to stay. That's why we have an army of interims in this space. Pay them. This is heavy duty work. This is not low level work. Understanding you have enough EQ and experience to really make change is important. Develop deployable methodologies. If you're going to work through other people, you best have a cookbook that, as Victoria talked about, that people can follow. At least understand what the base ingredients are. Commit to measurable goals beyond everybody loves you. And last but not least, rethink funding strategies. We spend time on what we pay for. So this is our 12-step plan. Go ahead, those on the call, go ahead and try it. We think it's going to work for you. So I'll turn it back to you, Rohit, to close us up.
Yep. Thanks, Deborah, and apologies to everyone. We're running out of time. It's been such a great conversation. I'll just give one final reminder that the full report is available for your reading. Use the link in the chat window. And with that, back to our administrator.